Welcome to Archive Vault, where we explore declassified records, hidden histories, and state-level investigations. Please note, some illustrative narration is AI-generated for storytelling purposes. All content is educational and documentary-based. At the height of American confidence, when the Cold War had ended and the economy appeared unstoppable, the White House became the center of a different kind of crisis. Not a war, not a recession, but a story about power, truth, and the private behavior of a public man. Bill Clinton entered the presidency in 1993 as a symbol of renewal. Young, articulate, politically agile, he represented a generational shift after 12 years of Republican rule. His administration promised competence, optimism, and moral seriousness after decades marked by scandal and distrust. For many Americans, Clinton felt relatable. He played the saxophone. He spoke easily. He seemed human. That perception would later become both his greatest shield and his greatest liability. In 1995, a 22-year-old White House intern named Monica Lewinsky began working in the West Wing. She was not a public figure. She was not politically connected. She was one of hundreds of young staffers who moved through the corridors of power largely unseen. What followed, according to her later testimony, was a consensual but deeply unequal relationship with the President of the United States. At the time, no one outside a small circle knew. The affair unfolded quietly, hidden within the routines of government. Meetings continued. Briefings were held. The machinery of the state never stopped. But beneath the surface, a private boundary had been crossed, one that would eventually trigger a constitutional confrontation. The story did not emerge on its own. It collided with an already active investigation. Independent counsel Kenneth Starr had been appointed to investigate unrelated matters involving the Clintons, including past business dealings in Arkansas. As the investigation expanded, it absorbed new allegations, new witnesses, and eventually new evidence. Monica Lewinsky's name entered the national conversation in January 1998. At first, the president denied everything. Standing before cameras, Bill Clinton delivered a statement that would echo through history. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman. It was definitive, it was absolute, and it was false." What followed was not merely a scandal, but a test of institutions. Investigators uncovered physical evidence. Testimony was given under oath. The distinction between private misconduct and public deception became the central question. The issue was no longer the affair itself, but whether the president had lied under oath and obstructed justice. In December 1998, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Bill Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction. The United States had reached a rare moment, only the second presidential impeachment in its history. The Senate trial that followed was as much a cultural event as a legal one. Cable news ran nonstop. Polls measured public fatigue. Americans argued over morality, legality, and intent. Many disapproved of Clinton's behavior, yet a majority opposed removing him from office. The economy was strong. There was no clear replacement. The country, it seemed, was willing to separate character from performance. In February 1999, the Senate acquitted Bill Clinton. He completed his second term. Politically, he survived. But something fundamental had shifted. The Lewinsky scandal altered how power was perceived. It normalized the idea that personal misconduct could coexist with public success. It introduced a new era of relentless media scrutiny, and it reinforced a pattern attaching itself to the Clinton name: controversy, denial, investigation, survival. For Monica Lewinsky, the consequences were different. Her life was permanently altered. She became a symbol, a punchline, a target. Only years later would public sentiment begin to shift, reframing her story as one about imbalance, exploitation, and institutional failure. For Bill Clinton, the scandal became both an endpoint and a beginning. When he left office in 2001, he did not retreat from public life. Instead, he entered a new phase, global, philanthropic, and largely unregulated by the structures that once constrained him. The Clinton Foundation expanded rapidly. International travel increased. Private donors and elite connections multiplied. It was in this post-presidential world, beyond elections, beyond oversight, that new relationships formed. Some were celebrated, others would later raise questions. At the time, few were paying attention. The Lewinsky scandal had taught the public a lesson that even the most serious allegations could be absorbed, reframed, and survived. That memory would matter later when new names entered the record, when flight logs surfaced, when associations once dismissed as irrelevant began to look different in hindsight. Part 1 ends here, not with resolution, but with context. Because before the private jets, before the islands, before the sealed files and the unanswered questions, there was a pattern already established, a precedent, a presidency that weathered scandal not by transparency, but by endurance. And in the years that followed, endurance would once again be tested. When Bill Clinton left the White House in January 2001, he entered a political space with few rules and enormous freedom. Former presidents were no longer bound by daily oversight, but they retained something just as powerful: access. Access to donors, access to governments, access to private individuals seeking legitimacy through proximity. This was the environment in which Jeffrey Epstein moved comfortably. Epstein was not a politician. He held no elected office and no official government role. Yet by the early 1990s, he had positioned himself inside elite circles that included financiers, academics, royalty, and political figures. His wealth was opaque. His resume was thin. But his usefulness was clear. He connected people. He funded causes. He opened doors. During the Clinton presidency, Epstein began appearing at events tied to Democratic fundraising and social gatherings linked to the White House. Visitor logs later showed Epstein entered the White House multiple times during the 1990s. These were not random visits. They were part of a broader pattern, Epstein embedding himself where power concentrated. At the time, there was nothing publicly criminal attached to his name. Epstein donated money to organizations connected to Clinton-era politics, including contributions to the White House Historical Association. He was photographed alongside prominent figures. He cultivated an image of a well-connected financier with global interests, particularly in philanthropy, science, and education. Crucially, Epstein was rarely alone. By his side was Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of media magnate Robert Maxwell. Maxwell functioned as a gatekeeper, a social engineer who introduced Epstein to influential networks on both sides of the Atlantic. Together, they created an atmosphere of exclusivity: private dinners, private planes, private islands. After Clinton left office, the relationship shifted from proximity to collaboration. The Clinton Foundation expanded rapidly in the early 2000s, positioning itself as a global humanitarian force. Its initiatives focused on HIV/AIDS, disaster relief, and economic development. These efforts required money, access, and international mobility. Epstein, who presented himself as a philanthropist with global reach, fit naturally into that ecosystem. Between 2001 and 2005, Bill Clinton traveled extensively on Epstein's private jet. Flight logs later showed Clinton aboard Epstein's plane multiple times, visiting locations across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Clinton's representatives would later state that these trips were related to foundation work and humanitarian causes. What mattered was not only the travel, but the optics. Epstein was not a passive passenger. He was the host. His aircraft became a moving extension of his network, one where power operated beyond public view. For Clinton, accustomed to secure government transport during his presidency, this private arrangement marked a significant shift. Years later, when Epstein's criminal history became public, these associations would be re-examined frame by frame. At the time, few asked questions. Epstein's 2008 plea deal in Florida, where he avoided federal charges and served minimal jail time for sex crimes involving minors, was handled quietly. The case barely registered in national conversation. Epstein was labeled a disgraced financier, not a central threat. Many powerful figures distanced themselves quietly. Others did not. Clinton's office would later state that ties with Epstein were severed by 2005, before the plea deal became public knowledge. Clinton has repeatedly said he had no awareness of Epstein's crimes during their association and never visited Epstein's private island. These statements matter, but so does timing. Epstein's access to elite circles did not end with suspicion. It ended only when exposure became unavoidable. By the late 2000s, journalists and investigators began reconstructing Epstein's rise, mapping how someone with no transparent source of wealth had gained such extraordinary access. Patterns emerge. So did familiar names. The Clintons were not alone on that list, but they were prominent. What made their connection different was history, a presidency that had survived scandal, a public condition to separate behavior from consequence, a narrative already familiar with denial, investigation, and endurance. Part 2 does not accuse. It documents proximity. It shows how power moves when no one is watching, how relationships form not in secret meetings, but in plain sight, normalized by status, shielded by reputation, and rarely questioned until it is too late. By the time Epstein's world began to collapse, the connections had already been made. The flights had already occurred. The photographs already taken. The question that would follow was not only what happened, but why so many people for so long chose not to look. By the mid-2000s, Jeffrey Epstein's life had become a study in contradiction. He was a financier, a socialite, a philanthropist, or at least that was the image presented to the world. Behind closed doors, authorities were quietly investigating allegations of sexual abuse involving minors. Yet Epstein's circle remained extensive, reaching into governments, universities, media, and private foundations. Bill Clinton's name appeared repeatedly in this web of associations. The flight logs of Epstein's private jet, later publicly released, showed Clinton traveling on the aircraft at least 26 times between 2001 and 2005, visiting destinations across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Official explanations cited humanitarian missions and Clinton Foundation initiatives. Clinton's office maintained that he never visited Epstein's private island, and that he had cut ties well before Epstein's legal troubles became widely known. The significance, however, was not merely the trips themselves, but the environment they represented. Epstein's plane, often referred to in media accounts as the Lolita Express, became emblematic of a world where access, privilege, and secrecy converge. Passengers were often high profile, and the destinations, private islands, secluded estates, added layers of isolation from public scrutiny. During these years, Epstein's ability to navigate the law added to his influence. In 2008, he struck a plea deal in Florida that allowed him to serve minimal jail time for serious sexual offenses, avoiding federal prosecution. For investigators and journalists who had begun tracing his connections, the deal raised questions. How did someone with such extensive allegations escape the consequences of federal law? Clinton, meanwhile, remained a figure of global influence. The Clinton Foundation's work expanded, and Clinton himself traveled the world, often interacting with leaders, philanthropists, and donors. His post-presidential life, as with his presidency, operated in a sphere where personal conduct was largely filtered through advisors, spokespeople, and official explanations. As Epstein's network continued quietly behind the scenes, media and political scrutiny increased. Journalists began cataloging photographs, flight logs, and witness statements, highlighting the overlap between Epstein and influential figures, including Clinton. What emerges is a pattern of access without accountability, where public officials and private magnates coexist in a space insulated from public oversight. This episode of connection and proximity culminates in the public unraveling of Epstein's world in 2019. But to understand the broader narrative, it is critical to recognize how these relationships were formed long before the headlines. These were not clandestine meetings in basements. They were social arrangements, dinners, philanthropic events, and flights that blurred the lines between public duty and private privilege. Part 3 ends with a tension already present but not yet fully realized. Power mingling with secrecy, proximity overlapping with moral and legal ambiguity. The threads are woven, the questions are mounting. Because when Epstein's criminal activity could no longer be contained, the associations that seemed harmless or merely social would be examined under a far harsher lens. The year was 2019. Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on federal charges of sex trafficking involving minors. For decades, he had moved quietly among the world's elite, shielded by wealth, influence, and the mistakes or choices of those around him. Now the walls of that private empire were cracking. Suddenly, names that had previously been whispered in private circles became topics of public scrutiny. Flight logs, photographs, and witness statements surfaced, showing prominent figures who had associated with Epstein. Among them was Bill Clinton. The former president's travel on Epstein's private plane, previously mentioned only in passing, was now a matter of public record. Every trip, every photo, every meeting became fodder for journalists, investigators, and a captivated public. Clinton's office responded swiftly, emphasizing the humanitarian purpose of his travel, the foundation work he had been doing, and his lack of knowledge regarding Epstein's criminal activity. Yet the narrative had shifted. The association alone, once a minor footnote, now raised uncomfortable questions about the company that power keeps. Epstein's death in August 2019 added another layer of complexity. Officially ruled a suicide in a federal jail, it immediately sparked controversy and conspiracy theories. Questions arose about who knew what and who benefited from Epstein's silence. Among the myriad names circulating in reports and social media speculation, the Clintons remained prominent, not as accused criminals, but as central figures in a network that the public was just beginning to map. In the following years, investigations continued. Congressional committees sought to uncover the extent of Epstein's connections and any potential lapses in oversight. Subpoenas were issued to institutions, associates, and even former presidents. By late 2025 and early 2026, the House Oversight Committee, under intense public pressure, subpoenaed Bill and Hillary Clinton to provide testimony and documents relating to Epstein and his network. Both resisted, citing political motivations and legal concerns. But the act itself reflected how the Epstein case had evolved from a private criminal investigation into a national reckoning over power, influence, and accountability. The broader picture revealed more than individual actions. It highlighted a system where elite networks shielded their members, where philanthropy and politics could mask questionable associations, and where legal outcomes often depended on influence as much as evidence. For Clinton, the intersection with Epstein became a test of public perception. Years earlier, he had survived the Lewinsky scandal, navigating impeachment and media scrutiny with careful messaging and political resilience. Now, decades later, he faced a new kind of challenge. His name linked to a figure whose crimes had shocked the world, whose secrecy had long protected the powerful, and whose death left unanswered questions. This episode is not about judgment. It is about tracing the connections, understanding the networks, and observing how power operates behind closed doors. It is about recognizing that proximity to influence carries risks that may not be immediate, but that history will eventually uncover. Part 4 closes with a world on the edge of revelation. Epstein's empire was gone, but the questions remained. Who knew? What did they know? And what, if anything, were they willing to reveal? The stage was set for the final chapter, where myth, speculation, and documented reality collide, and the legacy of power faces its most complex scrutiny yet. With Epstein dead, the public was left to sift through a labyrinth of documents, photographs, and witness statements, trying to separate the shadows from the facts. For years, speculation had run rampant. Conspiracy theories proliferated online. High-profile names, politicians, royalty, financiers were linked to Epstein's private world. But what did the evidence actually show? Bill and Hillary Clinton's names appear repeatedly in flight logs, photographs, and public records. Clinton traveled on Epstein's plane multiple times, met him at events, and received introductions through Maxwell and other associates. Hillary Clinton, while less prominently mentioned, is connected through shared social circles and philanthropic networks. Yet no public record, no court filing, and no credible investigative report has ever accused either of criminal wrongdoing related to Epstein's crimes. The distinction is critical. Proximity does not equal participation. Access does not equal complicity. What the records do reveal is the influence of power, how elite networks overlap, how philanthropy, politics, and social status can intersect, and how some individuals benefit from association while remaining insulated from accountability. For Epstein, the consequences of exposure were catastrophic. His empire collapsed, his secrecy evaporated, and his crimes became undeniable. For Clinton, the consequences were largely reputational. Flight logs and photographs raised questions, fueled media narratives, and deepened partisan divides. But they did not establish criminal liability. History, in this sense, treated him differently. Yet the public fascination with these intersections speaks to a broader truth. Power rarely exists in isolation. Networks form, reputations are managed, and information is controlled. The Epstein case illustrates how secrecy can coexist with visibility, and how individuals operating in the same circles can experience radically different outcomes. For viewers and listeners, the lesson is clear but uncomfortable. Investigate carefully. Question relentlessly. Recognize patterns of influence and behavior without leaping to conclusions. Truth exists, but it is often hidden beneath layers of social privilege and institutional protection. As the dust settled, the narrative of Bill and Hillary Clinton, like that of Epstein himself, became part of a larger story. The story of America's elites, the structures that protect them, and the scandals that reveal them. Some questions remain unanswered. Some truths may never be fully known. And yet, even in the absence of certainty, the record we do have allows us to trace connections, understand the systems of influence, and reflect on the consequences of power unrestrained. In the end, the Epstein network and its entanglements with figures like Clinton are not just a story about one man or one couple. They are a lens through which we can examine society itself, the structures that elevate, the forces that conceal, and the enduring tension between public duty and private action. For those who witnessed it, for those who study it, and for those who listen now, the lesson is not sensational, it is sober. In a world of extreme influence, access is power, and scrutiny is the only check. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. Wishing you a great week ahead, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.